In the summer of 48 BC, two Roman armies stared at each other across a Greek plain, while the fate of Western civilization hung by a thread. On one side, 45,000 men under the banner of the Senate, convinced they would crush the rebel who had crossed the Rubicon. On the other, barely 22,000 ragged, starving veterans, outnumbered 2-1, led by a man who had wagered everything on a single throw of the dice. But what Pompey the Great did not know was that, hidden behind Caesar's cavalry, 6 cohorts waited in silence. An invisible trap, a secret weapon no one had ever seen on a Roman battlefield. And when the Pompeian cavalry charged with 7,000 horsemen against the right flank, believing victory was assured, the world stopped. Trumpets tore through the air. The men of the fourth line rose like ghosts from the dust. Their javelins did not fly. They were thrust directly into the faces of the riders. Screams, horses collapsing, blood spattering shields, the thunder of hooves transformed into chaos. The most powerful cavalry in the Mediterranean fled in terror toward the hills. Archers and slingers were slaughtered without mercy. And then those 6 cohorts wheeled like a deadly scythe and fell upon the rear of the senatorial army. In less than 2 hours, 15,000 Romans lay dead under the Thessalian sun. 24,000 more threw down their swords and knelt before the victor. When Caesar walked the field at dusk, gazing upon the bodies of senators, patricians, and soldiers who had once been his countrymen, he spoke words that would echo through the ages. This is what they wanted. That afternoon, beneath a sky stained with blood and dust, the Roman Republic breathed its last, and from its ashes, an empire began to rise. To understand how Rome came to tear itself apart on the fields of Pharsalus, one must look back to the heart of a crisis that had been brewing for decades. The republic that had once conquered the Mediterranean was rotting from within. The Senate, dominated by a corrupt and arrogant aristocracy known as the Optimates, clung to power with bloodied fingernails. Opposing them, the populares sought reforms that would benefit veterans, small landowners, and the rising classes of an expanding empire. This was not merely politics, it was a war between worlds. At the center of this storm stood 2 men whose ambitions would collide like titans. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus had been Rome's most celebrated general for decades, conqueror of the East, exterminator of pirates, 3 times consul. His name was synonymous with military glory. But Pompey had spent more than 10 years away from the battlefield, wrapped in senatorial intrigues, slowly losing the edge that had made him legendary. Gaius Julius Caesar was an entirely different creature. Born to a patrician family that had fallen on hard times, he had climbed every rung of Roman power through a lethal combination of charisma, intelligence, and audacity. During 8 years in Gaul, he had forged the most fearsome army Rome had ever seen. His legions did not fight for the Republic. They fought for Caesar. They would follow him to hell if he commanded it. Both men had once been allies. Together with Marcus Licinius Crassus, they formed the First Triumvirate, a secret pact that ruled Rome from the shadows. Pompey even married Julia, Caesar's daughter. But Julia died in childbirth in 54 BC, and with her died the last bond between the 2 generals. Crassus fell a year later at Carrhae, slaughtered by the Parthians. The triumvirate dissolved, and Rome was left with 2 hungry wolves staring at each other across the Tiber. The Senate, fearing Caesar's growing power, demanded that he disband his legions and return to Rome as a private citizen. They knew what that meant: political trials, exile, perhaps death. Caesar knew it too. In January of 49 BC, he made a decision that would change history. With a single legion, he crossed the small river Rubicon, the boundary between Gaul and Roman Italy. Civil war had begun. Pompey, surprised by the speed of Caesar's advance, abandoned Rome without giving battle. He crossed the Adriatic to Greece, where he could gather the vast forces of the Roman East. His plan was sound: exhaust Caesar, cut his supplies, destroy him without risking a pitched battle. It was the strategy of Fabius against Hannibal, proven and safe. Caesar quickly consolidated Italy and Hispania before pursuing his rival. In January of 48 BC, with the recklessness that defined him, he crossed the Adriatic in the middle of winter with only 15,000 men, slipping past the Pompeian fleet. Mark Antony brought reinforcements months later, and the two armies began a deadly dance across the Balkans. At Dyrrhachium, Caesar attempted to besiege the Pompeian army, but was defeated. His lines were broken, his men slaughtered. It was the worst defeat of his career. Any other general would have sued for peace. Caesar retreated toward Thessaly, bleeding but alive, seeking ground where he could fight on his own terms. Pompey followed, pressured by the senators who accompanied him. Men like Cato, Scipio, and Domitius Ahenobarbus demanded a decisive victory. They called him Agamemnon, King of Kings, mocking his caution. They were already dividing the government positions they would hold after crushing the rebel. They prepared victory banquets before drawing their swords. Pompey yielded against his better judgment. He descended from the hills where he held tactical advantage and offered battle on the plain of Pharsalus. It was exactly what Caesar needed. The two men who would face each other on that 9th of August could not have been more different in temperament and method. Caesar, at 52 years old, was a whirlwind of nervous energy. He slept little, dictated letters while riding, made decisions with a speed that left his enemies stunned. His genius lay in adaptation. He never fought the same battle twice. Every combat was a brilliant improvisation, a chess game where he moved the pieces faster than his opponent could think. Pompey, 6 years older, was a general from another era, methodical, careful. He preferred overwhelming force to audacious maneuver. He had won his wars by crushing enemies with numerical superiority, not tactical tricks. Now, with 45,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry against Caesar's 22,000 men, he believed he had won the battle before it began. But there was a crucial difference that the numbers did not show. Caesar's legionaries were veterans of Gaul, men who had fought together for a decade against Germans, Gauls, and Britons. They knew their centurions by name. They knew their general as a stern but fair father who shared their hardships. They were willing to die for him, not from duty, but from loyalty. Pompey's army was something else entirely. His legions had been recently recruited in the east. Many soldiers were allies, not Romans. Syrians, Greeks, Anatolians. The officers were senators competing against each other for glory and spoils. Labienus himself, Caesar's former lieutenant who had defected, openly despised the troops he now commanded. Before the battle, he declared that the Gallic war veterans were finished, that only invalids and recruits remained. Labienus was fatally wrong. On the eve of combat, while the enemy camps glowed under the stars, barely 5 kilometers apart, the two generals prepared their plans. Pompey entrusted everything to his cavalry. 7,000 horsemen, the largest mounted force ever assembled by Rome, would overwhelm Caesar's right flank, encircle his army, and destroy it from the rear. It was a simple plan, almost obvious, and that obviousness would be its undoing. Caesar observed the enemy disposition from a hill and immediately understood what Pompey intended. Then he did something no Roman general had ever attempted. He withdrew one cohort from each of his third-line legions, approximately 3,000 men, and formed them into a hidden fourth line, positioned at a diagonal angle behind his right flank, invisible from the Pompeian position. Waiting in silence, he gave them a specific order. When the enemy cavalry charged, they were to leap up and attack, but not throw their javelins. They were to use them as spears, thrusting them directly into the faces of the horsemen. Caesar knew the vanity of Roman youth. Those young aristocrats who comprised Pompey's cavalry would fear disfigurement more than death. That night, a meteor crossed the sky above the Pompeian camp, Some took it as an ill omen. Pompey dreamed that the Roman people acclaimed him as he dedicated a temple to Venus Victrix, the goddess of victory. But Venus was the patron deity of the Julian family. The dream was a warning Pompey did not know how to interpret. The dawn of August 9th painted the hills of Thessaly in golden and crimson tones. The air was still, heavy with dust and tension. From his position, Caesar could see the Pompeian ranks stretching like a sea of bronze and iron. 110 cohorts formed in triple line, 10 men deep. The right wing anchored to the Enipeus River, the left wing crowned by the dark mass of 7,000 horsemen. Caesar deployed his 9 legions in thinner lines to match the enemy front. Mark Antony commanded the left with the 8th and 9th legions. The latter weakened from Dyrrhachium. Domitius Calvinus held the center. Caesar himself positioned on the right, beside his beloved 10th legion, the unit he had led since the beginning of the Gallic Wars. Behind him, invisible, the 4th line waited. Pompey had ordered his infantry to remain stationary, expecting the Caesarians to exhaust themselves crossing the field. It was a defensive tactic, strange for an army that outnumbered the enemy 2 to 1. When Caesar's first line advanced and saw the enemy did not respond, they halted midway to catch their breath. It was a moment of extraordinary discipline. Then they continued, launched their javelins, and crashed against the wall of Pompeian shields. The center of the field erupted in the clamor of combat, iron against iron, screams and groans, the smell of blood and sweat filling the air. But the real battle was decided on the flanks. Labienus gave the order, and 7,000 horsemen charged against Caesar's right. The thunder of hooves drowned out all other sounds. Caesar's 1,000 cavalry, mostly German and Gallic auxiliaries, resisted briefly before falling back. The Pompeian cavalry began to envelop the flank, exactly as planned. Then Caesar raised his hand. The trumpet sounded a call that no one in the Pompeian army recognized. From the cloud of dust behind the Caesarian line emerged 3,000 men no one had seen. They ran toward the cavalry like demons without throwing their javelins. They thrust them upward, directly into the faces of the riders. The effect was devastating. The young aristocrats who had never faced anything like this panicked. Riders fell, with eyes burst open, cheeks pierced, screams transformed into gurgles. Horses reared, throwing their riders. Within minutes, the most powerful cavalry in the Mediterranean scattered toward the hills, abandoning the field. Behind them remained the Pompeian archers and slingers, now unprotected. The 4th line slaughtered them without mercy. Then it wheeled and fell upon the left flank of the senatorial army like a scythe harvesting wheat. Pompey, watching from a hill, saw the disaster unfold. He understood in that instant that the battle was lost. Without a word, he turned his horse and rode toward his camp, leaving behind 45,000 men who still fought in his name. The general's retreat broke the army's spirit. The news ran through the ranks like fire through dry grass. Soldiers who a moment before had pushed with fury began to look over their shoulders. The left wing collapsed, the center trembled. The right tried to hold, but the avalanche was unstoppable. Caesar ordered his 3rd line forward, fresh troops against exhausted men. The Pompeian army shattered like a wave against a cliff. What had been combat became a pursuit, and then a slaughter. The Caesarians chased the fugitives to the Pompeian camp, which they found prepared for a victory banquet. Tables covered with silver, tents adorned with ivy, wine cooling in jars. The senators' arrogance transformed into spoils of war. When the sun began to descend, the field of Pharsalus was a mosaic of horror. 15,000 Romans lay dead, most fallen during the flight, stabbed in the back as they ran. The eagles of 9 legions had been captured. 180 standards lay in the dust. 24,000 survivors, trapped in the nearby hills, surrendered the following morning. Caesar, in a gesture that would define his legacy, offered them clemency. There were no mass executions, no enslavement. He asked only that they swear never to take up arms against him again. Among the dead was Gaius Crestinus, a veteran centurion of the 10th who had led the first charge. Caesar paid him special honors and ordered that he be buried with distinction. He had been the first man to strike the enemy, and he died with an enemy's sword thrust through his mouth and out the back of his neck. Caesar walked the field that night, accompanied only by torches and silence. He gazed upon the faces of men he had known, senators with whom he had debated, officers with whom he had dined, patricians whose families intertwined with his own for generations. "This is what they wanted," he murmured. Those were his only words. Pompey fled toward Egypt, seeking refuge at the court of the young Pharaoh Ptolemy. But the Egyptian advisors, calculating that Caesar would be the ultimate victor, decided to win his favor with a macabre gift. When Pompey landed on the shores of Pelusium, he was stabbed in the back, decapitated, and his body abandoned on the beach. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria weeks later, he was presented with the head of his old rival and his signet ring. The conqueror of Gaul, the victor of Pharsalus, the most powerful man in the Roman world, turned away and wept. Pharsalus did not end the civil war. Pompey's sons and the senatorial faction continued fighting in Africa and Hispania for years more. But Rome's fate was sealed that afternoon in Thessaly. The Republic, which had governed the Mediterranean world for 5 centuries, died on that field alongside the 15,000 men who defended it. Caesar returned to Rome as dictator, first for 10 years, then for life. He reformed the calendar, expanded citizenship, planned conquests that would have carried the Roman eagles to India. But the ghosts of Pharsalus haunted him. The very men he had pardoned, to whom he had given clemency when he could have executed them, conspired in the shadows. On the Ides of March in 44 BC, 23 daggers found Caesar's body in the Senate. Marcus Junius Brutus, whom he had pardoned after Pharsalus, drove one of them. The clemency that had defined Caesar's victory became the instrument of his death. But what Caesar built survived his assassins. From the civil wars that followed emerged Octavian, his adopted heir, who would become Augustus, the first emperor. The system born at Pharsalus would govern the Mediterranean world for 500 years more. Later, historians would debate endlessly about that 9th of August. Some condemned Caesar as the tyrant who destroyed republican liberty. Others celebrated him as the visionary who saved Rome from a corrupt and decadent aristocracy. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between, buried beneath layers of propaganda, idealization, and oblivion. What cannot be denied is the magnitude of the moment. In less than 2 hours, on a dusty Greek plain, the history of the world turned on its axis. The Republic died, the Empire was born, and the tactical genius of a single man, the innovation of a hidden fourth line, changed the course of Western civilization. Today, the fields of Pharsalus are farmland where Greek farmers plant olives and wheat. No monument marks the exact spot where 15,000 Romans fell. The Enipeus River flows quietly, without memory of the blood that once stained its waters. Dust has covered the swords and bones for millennia, but the echo of that battle persists in the power structures we inherited, in the very concept of empire, in the eternal tension between republic and autocracy, between the people and their leaders, between liberty and order. Pharsalus reminds us that empires are born in mud and blood, that the decisions of a single day can shape centuries, and that even the oldest and most venerated systems can die within hours under the merciless sun of a summer afternoon, when 2 men who were once allies decide that the world is not big enough for both of them. This is what they wanted, and so it was written in history with iron and fire forever.